Welcome to Truth Be Told About Going Wild. I'm your host, Robert Hensley, and this is the podcast inspired by the principles of personal rewilding. There's an amazing story I read about the first biodome in the 1970s and how they planted these beautiful trees and these plants, and how as they matured, they didn't stand. They were kind of limp and just lay over. And it took some time before they realized that because there was no airflow, because there was no wind, because these plants weren't faced with any challenges, natural adversaries, if you will, they didn't need to grow strong. They didn't face any opposition that would force them to strengthen and become hard and solid wood, right? And it got me thinking about the concept of nature versus nurture, and this idea that nature does nurture. People talk about the relationship between man and nature as being a challenge, that there is something to overcome, to win, to conquer. And in a way, that's true. We don't want to dispel the fact that being in nature can be challenging. But those challenges are what allow us to become strong and stand tall and to be resilient. If we look at the way that society has formed or developed and continues to develop, evolve, then we start thinking about this idea of what man is really facing, the adversities in the world. They're not natural adversities. When we're all stacked into cities or we're in a crowded suburb, if we're not self-reliant in any way, if we're not connecting with the natural world and spending time outside and seeing what real challenges and natural adversities are, then we're only ever facing man-made challenges. And in that way, we are not at all resilient. We are not strong, right? So think about this, right? When we are little, right? And I know this is especially true for people of a certain generation, but when we were little, we played outside. We played in the dirt. We had dirt beneath our nails, on our face, up our noses, and our ears, and we were healthy. We were, yes, dealing with germs and microbes and things from the natural world, but those things allowed our bodies to develop natural immunities. If we look at populations born after a certain point in the 90s-ish, where people became so concerned with antibacterial and antimicrobial, and things became so distilled and so neutral, it became this thing where children became much more sickly. They weren't forming the same kinds of immunity that their predecessors had, that their ancestors had, because they weren't experiencing or being exposed to or allowed to be exposed to these natural adversities, these things that we needed to come up against in order to form those kinds of cells, right? The code was there in our genetics, but that doesn't mean that we didn't have to have something to trigger, that immunity. We look at that now in terms of, we're looking at, facing different pandemics, right? And again, a lot of the things that we are not ready for or that we are not immune for come from the fact that we no longer spend any time in the natural world or enough time among the natural world to build up any kind of protection for ourselves, right? We are at the mercy of, scientists to develop cures um, that otherwise we might be able to um, find or develop on our own. And if we think about this idea of, facing challenges and learning and growing, right? We have to think too about the time that we spend in nature that is not adversarial, right? Where we're not facing challenges. When we look at the scientific research of just being outside, of walking amongst a particular grove of trees, say cedar trees or particular pine trees, that there are these, essential oils and fragrances in nature that trigger within our own bodies, you know, um, an immune response, right? That tell our bodies that we need to kick our, you know, NK cells, the natural killer cells that fight, cancers and tumors and things, into overdrive. And we only receive that if we're outside. Yes, we can kind of replicate that if we bring those smells and those oils into an interior setting and we, pump them into the air. But we, that's a lot of work that we have to pay someone a lot of money to do, to make happen, when it exists for free, just walking out in the world, right? So, when we think about, again, nature versus nurture, some of that to me is that we've forgotten that nature is there to nurture us, to protect us, to present us with some of those small challenges, those things that just require us to experience the world and learn, right? I don't think, for myself, I don't see nature as being something that is so challenging to overcome that it's going to take my life. I think that if we settle into and reconnect to nature and rekindle that relationship with the natural world, that we learn from nature, we get nurtured in a way that nature has provided us with just about everything that we could possibly need, and that it's possible to rely on yourself and rely on the natural world and not rely solely on industry to protect us, to live well, to be healthy, to um, have the things that we need. I think that we've stepped so far to one side of the line here that we are literally killing ourselves when, there's a warm and welcome, um, when there's a warm welcome to be had just next door, right? The grass is always greener. Yes, it is always greener. And sometimes it truly is the better place to be, especially if what's next door is, a relationship with the natural world, right? If we can simply go and spend time outside, if we can be in nature and reap these amazing benefits for our minds and our bodies. So that's what I want everyone to meditate on. That's my goal. I want everyone to be thinking about how they live, how they relate to the natural world, and what they might be missing out on in this, in that relationship, right? What natural forms of immunity, what health benefits, mental and physical, are we missing out on by not being connected to nature? And how can we rectify that? How do we stop being so reliant upon, industry and man-made things to protect us, when we could simply just step out our front doors and go out into a green space, a blue space, and find all of those things just available to us for free? So, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of Truth Be Told about Going Wild with Robert Hensley. Remember, there are 3 opportunities each week for new content from the Truth Be Told family of podcasts on the Club Paranormal channel on YouTube. And that's Tony Sweet on Fridays with the original Truth Be Told, Bonnie Burkert on Wednesdays with Truth Be Told Transformation, and of course, Truth Be Told About Going Wild every Monday. And all of those shows are live at 3 p.m., 6 Eastern, on their respective days. And if you'd like to know more about personal rewilding and what I'm up to, please visit my website at www.rhnaturereconnect.com. Again, that's rhnaturereconnectaltogether.com. And I look forward to talking with you again soon. Until next time.